Hello and welcome to episode 77 of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling from 1870 to 1930. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about a pioneer in both physical culture and publishing, but who also spent time in St. Louis as a lightweight Greco-Roman professional wrestler. And this gentleman's name is Bernarr MacFadden. He was born Bernard Adolphus MacFadden in Mill Springs, Missouri. But he became famous as a publisher of physical culture, true detective, true crime, and his publishing company is still around today. After he changed his name to Bernarr MacFadden. Bernarr is the first name. Instead of MC, which was his original name, he changed his last name to capital M-A-C, capital F-A-D-D-E-N. MacFadden was a pioneer. He was a physical culture proponent and one of the weirdest guys who ever walked the face of this earth. So we'll get into this week's topic here in a few minutes. For the update this week, I had an email, and the email was from a longtime listener, Shannon, who hadn't had a chance to write in a while. And thank you for your email, Shannon, and thank you for the topic as well, because I've decided we're going to do an episode here in the next few weeks about Bronco Nagurski. He was, yes, more of a performer, but he had a pretty interesting career and had some really credible matches with Landis, who was not always the most cooperative person in the world, and several other wrestlers. So we're going to do an episode about Bronco Nagurski. One of the things Shannon had mentioned is he was glad I was going away from the AEW and WWF reviews. I will actually, in the review, or actually the recommendation for today is a 1930s match, and then I'm going to tell you why I've definitely decided that I'm going to tap out on doing reviews of the more modern stuff. I may mention it, particularly if we have something newsworthy that comes up. I do still try to cover the news. I've discovered over the past few weeks that most of the modern wrestling is best in very small doses. There won't be a whole lot of reviews of either AEW or WWE in the future. And I still have hopes of finally... both my sons are supposed to watch the Iron Claw in the next 2 weeks. We may be doing the Iron Claw review in like May. As soon as I could get the two of them to watch it, we will definitely be reviewing the Iron Claw. And I've already got my notes on it where I can tell you where because they bounce all over in the timeline for that. The book on the Divided Championship era is coming along well. I've probably a half to a third of the way through, and I'm thinking that it's going to come out sometime between March and June. Stay tuned for more. I think I'm going to jump right into the history topic because I'm afraid I might get into a little bit of a rant towards the end of the program when I talk about why I'm tapping out on modern wrestling. So I'm going to jump into the history topic this week. And I want to start by saying for the longest time, I knew that Bernarr MacFadden had wrestled in St. Louis professionally. I didn't know much more than that. And I had been looking in the St. Louis newspaper archives for a couple of years now, trying to find information about his professional wrestling career here. I searched by both his given name and his professional name later on in his career when he was a publisher, and I had absolutely no luck in finding anything about Bernarr MacFadden. And I'd kind of given up, and I was researching the history of the early St. Louis promotion, which will definitely be a book project at some point, whether it's part of a book about Landis' time in St. Louis, or if it's just about the early formation of the promotion in St. Louis, because it really was in 2 steps. Well, 3, actually. The promotion got started by some businessmen associated with the Chicago promotion in late 1921. In 1922, a gentleman by the name of John Contos, who went on to manage Dan Koloff, which is why he left St. Louis and why he left the promotion in the hands of his nephew, Tom Pax, who had lived in Chicago up until that point. And Contos later became the promoter in Atlanta during the 1920s. During the divided championship era, he was the main promoter in Atlanta, promoting a lot of the matches that Stecker wrestled, and then eventually Lewis started wrestling there as well, even though he wasn't billed as a world champion. In researching that, I stumbled across an article by one of the St. Louis newspaper writers who had been covering wrestling since the 1880s. And in that, he was mentioning some of the greatest matches that he ever saw in St. Louis, and one of those involved Bernarr MacFadden, who wrestled in St. Louis as B.A., the first two initials of his actual name, and his actual last name of MacFadden, M-C-F-A-D-D-E-N. When I put in B.A. MacFadden into the archive, I turned up like 1,000 newspaper articles mentioning him. He was, for about 4 years, a professional Greco-Roman wrestler in St. Louis. And from about 1889 to January of 1894, in February 1894, he goes to New York. And his professional wrestling career is pretty much over by that point. He was thinking about retiring from professional wrestling anyway before he left St. Louis, because his physical culture training business, and he had already written at least one physical culture book by that time, that was taking up so much of his time. He didn't have the time to train appropriately for professional wrestling, number one. Number two, he felt that professional wrestling of any kind, Greco-Roman or catch wrestling, led to uneven physical development, which was against his goals in physical culture, which was to develop a symmetrical, evenly developed physique with no muscle imbalances. And muscle imbalances are a big deal. As you get older, muscle imbalances can cause you a lot of problems when it comes to walking or doing everyday tasks. So it's always good to try to prevent muscle imbalances as much as you can. But we're jumping a little bit ahead. MacFadden, I already knew he had been born Bernard Adolphus MacFadden in Mill Springs, Missouri on August 16th, 1868. He founds a publishing company in New York in 1899 that is still in operation today. If you look up, you've got to spell it the way he changed his name to, but if you look up MacFadden Publishing, M-A-C, capital F-A-D-D-E-N, Publications, it is still in operation today. Not selling the same magazines he was selling back in his day, but the company is still around. And we've already talked about MacFadden was an early proponent of physical culture, and part of that is based on his own personal story. MacFadden, born in Mill Springs, which is in rural Missouri, his parents both die by the time he's 11 years old. So at 11 years old, the family sends him to live with this farmer in the area because he's going to go to work for the farmer. This is not, the farmer's taking care of him as you would think of as a parent. This is, they have an employee-employee relationship. The farmer lets him live there. He feeds him, pays him for some of the work he does, and MacFadden works very, very hard. And MacFadden does that for 2 years, from the time he's 11 till the time he's 13. When he is 13, he comes to St. Louis in 1881, and he starts working an office job for the next 3 years. And MacFadden said by the time he was 16 years old, the sedentary work had almost turned him into an invalid, and he was walking and moving around like a 50 or a 60-year-old. MacFadden realizes he's got to change something, so he gets a gym membership, and he starts working out, doing what they would call physical culture, which was an early version of bodybuilding with weights, gymnastics, wrestling, and sometimes boxing. There were lots of clubs around this time. The Turners had a couple of clubs in St. Louis, but MacFadden went to the Missouri Gymnasium, which would, I think, eventually become the Missouri Businessmen's Gymnasium, which was eventually managed by Harry Cook in St. Louis. And all of the professional wrestlers and professional boxers that came to St. Louis trained at the Missouri Businessmen's Gymnasium run by Harry Cook. Harry Cook also helped promote some of the boxing in St. Louis. And when Lou Thesz started wrestling in the 1930s, he started training at Harry Cook's gymnasium. That's where all the professional wrestlers trained at. After 2 years of working out, MacFadden sees tremendous progress in his development. MacFadden is 5'5", 5'6", which is average for someone in that time. That would be about the average man's height in the 1890s. And he weighs 140 pounds, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but that was also average to a little bit above average for that time. So MacFadden is not small, but 140 is still a lightweight. He starts wrestling professionally Greco-Roman. He has a great 4-year career in St. Louis. The only person to beat him in the entire 4 years that he was here was a professional wrestler by the name of Max Lutbeg. And I've written about Lutbeg on my website, kenzermanjr.com, before. Lutbeg was a competent catch-as-catch-can wrestler primarily, and he primarily wrestled catch, but he wrestled MacFadden in 3 matches while they were in St. Louis. Lutbeg won one. They drew the other one. So before MacFadden left for New York, he wanted to get revenge for the one loss that he had in St. Louis. Before he can wrestle Lutbeg, though, Martin Muldoon, who is the younger brother of William Muldoon was the world heavyweight, or the world Greco-Roman heavyweight wrestling champion from 1880 to 1889. He was undefeated as champion. Nobody ever beat him, and he retired as the champion. His brother Martin was a very competent Greco-Roman wrestler, but he was smaller and not as accomplished as William. He came to St. Louis, and he agreed to throw MacFadden, who was considered, it was either MacFadden or George Baptiste was the best Greco-Roman wrestler in St. Louis, but MacFadden had the better reputation at the time. So MacFadden got the match with Muldoon. Muldoon agreed to throw MacFadden twice in 1 hour or concede the match to MacFadden. And he not only didn't throw him twice, he didn't throw him one time. MacFadden went the whole time limit without Muldoon able to throw him, so he was considered the winner of the match. And the 25-year-old MacFadden had granted an interview to the Post-Dispatch, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the local newspaper, after this match, and he had said that he was already thinking about retiring because he had already authored a successful book on physical culture, and he intended to publish magazines on physical culture, and he thought that his wrestling training and wrestling was getting in the way of that. He arranges for a match with Lutbeg in January of 1894. He wrestles Muldoon December 31st, 1893. He arranges for a match with Max Lutbeg in St. Louis, and it's not a mixed styles match. They're just going to wrestle a 2 out of 3 falls match with a 2-hour time limit, and they agree that if one person scores a fall, there's only one fall, that person will be considered the winner. The only thing that was banned from this match was the stranglehold. So, quick refresher, the stranglehold that we're talking about is not the Mataleon, the rear naked choke, the Hadaka Jimi from judo. That people commonly refer to as a sleeper hold in modern professional wrestling. We are talking about the front face lock or the guillotine choke version. This is the version that was actually used by Evan Strangler Lewis and was used by other catch wrestlers after him in professional wrestling matches. And that hold is eventually actually barred, mainly because of the nuisance that Evan Strangler Lewis made with it himself, strangling people and not letting them go and causing near riots in Chicago and Boston and Buffalo, New York. Evan Lewis was a mean, nasty guy, and you didn't have to do much to make him mad, and if you made him mad, watch out. So already in 1894, the stranglehold has a bad reputation because Evan Lewis used it the first time and wouldn't let go of the guy in January of 1886 when he put it on Sorikichi Matsuda and would not let him go. The stranglehold's the only thing that is banned. This match drew 2,000 fans to St. Louis's Music Hall on Saturday, January 27, 1894, to see the match. That is a huge crowd for St. Louis in that time. Now, by the 1920s, they're regularly drawing 9,000 fans to the Coliseum and even more to some of the outdoor shows. But this is before the successful promotion is set up. At this time, professional wrestling matches, there's no actual local promoter. Most of the times the gyms are functioning as the promoters for these events. And there's not a lot of money in it. They don't have professionals come through too often. Every once in a while, Evan Lewis will come through. When I say professionals, Max Lutbeg and B.A. MacFadden, who is also known as Barney MacFadden in St. Louis, they were professional wrestlers, but they were not known out of St. Louis. They were local professional wrestlers. Nationally known professional wrestlers came through infrequently. And when they did, they were usually local organizers, either a gymnasium or someone with some boxing promotion experience would be the person who promoted the card, but most of the money went to the wrestlers and their managers, and if the event was a success, the promoter would get a little bit of money too. So the promoter should have gotten money from this match as well as both of the wrestlers. Lutbeg, before the match even starts, asks to address the crowd, and he tells them he sprained his knee prior to the match. He says if he lost the match, he would accept the decision. However, Lutbeg said he wanted a rematch with MacFadden at 133 pounds if he did lose the match. The fans booed Lutbeg's statement as they preemptively saw it as an excuse he was trying to make before he even took part in the match. And Lutbeg was 127 pounds, which is 13 pounds lighter than MacFadden. And it's a huge weight difference at their level. You know, heavyweight, 14 pounds, 15 pounds, not that big a thing. When you're a lighter weight fighter, 127 pounds and 140 pounds, that's a huge difference. 20-pound differences between middleweight and light heavyweight, but you have 10-pound differences between bantamweight and featherweight. That's a huge advantage. They start to wrestle. MacFadden grabs a single leg for an attempted takedown, which he couldn't do in Greco-Roman wrestling, but this is not a Greco-Roman wrestling match. This is a catch-can wrestling match, which I think MacFadden had to agree to get Lutbeg to take part. But MacFadden grabbed the hold too close to the footlights. So realize they're not in a wrestling ring. The traditional setup for the 19th century and the first decade or two of the 20th century, the wrestling would occur on stages like in music halls, on mats or carpets that had been laid out on the floor. So they'd be up on the stage so that the fans could see them. But it was also very easy for them to go falling into the orchestra pit. That happened more often than you would think, where they got too close to the edge and they actually fell off. And some people got injured falling because some of those orchestra pits were 8 feet. I'm sorry, this orchestra pit was 8 foot below the level of the stage. So that's quite a fall, even if you land on your feet. The referee broke him and put him back in the center of the mat with MacFadden on Lutbeg's leg, but Lutbeg was able to spin out of the single leg takedown. MacFadden moves back in for a takedown. The fans heard a sickening thud, but they're both standing up, so nobody's hit the ground. And Lutbeg yelled at MacFadden had fouled him by headbutting him. But the referee said, no, this was not intentional, keep going. So Lutbeg elbows MacFadden in the jaw and tells the referee that wasn't intentional either. MacFadden tells Lutbeg, if you foul me again, I'm punching you. So the referee breaks them up, lectures them both, says, okay guys, keep this clean. And they go back to wrestling. But Lutbeg, whether he really had a knee injury or not, he's really struggling to keep MacFadden off of him. So he decides to do something desperate. And he applies a stranglehold, which we've already said was the one hold that they had banned by the pre-match agreement. Lutbeg knew his actions were going to lead to a DQ, but I think he knew he was probably going to lose anyway, so he was going to do what he needed to do to get out of the match and hope that he could ask for a rematch and maybe that would go differently. So Lutbeg used the guillotine choke, the front face lock, the stranglehold, and not only does he put it on MacFadden, but he lifts MacFadden off the ground while the referee's trying to pry Lutbeg off MacFadden. Now, the one good thing about him lifting him off the ground like that, he probably didn't have it cinched in on the choke as well as he should have, because it's hard to do both of those. It's hard to be squeezing the neck, but then lifting the body at the same time. I saw Paul Varlins do that to Marco Huas, but it was because he didn't have the choke on well, and Marco Huas was able to keep the pressure off of his neck, and all Varlins did was wear himself out doing that. This is probably what was going on here, too. And MacFadden has a very strong grip on Lutbeg's forearm, continuing to put pressure on that to try to keep the choke from tightening up. It actually takes 6 men, the referee and the seconds at ringside and a couple of the organizers, to pry Lutbeg off MacFadden as the crowd starts surging towards the stage. And now the St. Louis police are getting concerned because this looks like it could break loose at any time. The referee disqualifies Lutbeg, ends the match to prevent further antagonizing the crowd. And the crowd was very angry already, and then MacFadden showed him the bruises on his neck from where Lutbeg had picked him up off the floor, and now they are really ready to riot. The police decide, okay, we've got to end this before it gets ugly. They scoop up Lutbeg and get him off the stage back to the dressing room as soon as possible. Lutbeg, as he's being led away, is trying to say that the stranglehold was a legal wrestling hold and that he only agreed to the ban to make the match, but the fans started booing even louder, and the police are just like, please, just go back to the dressing room. Get out of here. The moral of the story, though, was Lutbeg never got his, the moral of the story. The conclusion of the story, there was no moral here, other than don't use the stranglehold when it's barred, was Lutbeg never got his rematch with MacFadden because MacFadden left St. Louis in February 1894 for New York, and he never came back. I mean, he might have come back to visit, but he stayed in New York, changed his name to Bernarr MacFadden, because the reason he did that is because he thought it sounded stronger, and started publishing Physical Culture magazine. And eventually in the 1920s, he would move into the pulp fiction magazines like True Detective and True Crime. MacFadden, I've always found to be a very odd guy. So I read one of his books. It was not his first book. I'd like to read his first book. Maybe it was more physical culture oriented and I would get more out of it. I read George Hackenschmidt's book, To Live in Health and Strength, which the last half of that, heck, maybe even 2/3 of that, is his life story. Minus, he doesn't discuss the Frank Gotch matches, which was a little disappointing. But you get a lot of his career in that book. And his views on training, even though it was from 100 years ago, I was able to take quite a bit from that when I read To Live in Health and Strength by George Hackenschmidt. I read Vitality Supreme by Bernarr MacFadden, and I didn't get anything out of it. There was a lot of esoteric knowledge about some inner healing exercises he recommended. There was very little on physical culture at all in the book that I read. He had some odd ideas when it came to physicians. He didn't believe in them. He didn't go see physicians. 2 of his children apparently passed away, and there were rumors it was because they didn't receive medical care because he didn't believe in doctors. But I do know that when he died, the condition he had was pretty minor, and that had he seen a doctor, he would have survived. But instead, he didn't believe in going to doctors. He didn't go to the doctor, and he died. And he always said that, first he said he was going to live forever, and then he said he was going to live at least to be 150 or 170, and he missed that by about 90 years. So I work with some of the most brilliant physicians in the world, and if I had my daughter or my sisters or anybody had some health issues, that's who I would want them to go to. So I found a lot of his ideas a little strange. He was one of the pioneers of physical culture, and without him, you probably would not have had the popularization that the Weeders brought years later with muscle power and muscle and fitness and flex and all that. I know that I've read in Joe Weider's biography that he was a reader of Physical Culture magazine, and that's one of the things that got him interested in the whole weight training, bodybuilding lifestyle. And then Joe Weider and Ben Weider had their publishing empire that built on what MacFadden did. So he's a pioneer, he is definitely a forward thinker, and he's also a very odd guy. My recommendation for something to review, and it's only about 3 minutes of probably a hour and a half, 2 hour match, is the 1928 match between Ed Strangler Lewis and Gus Sonnenberg. Lewis actually trained Sonnenberg, who was a football player for the professional wrestling ring. Sonnenberg was also just a pure performer, and despite the fact that Lewis did not want to put Munn over for the same reason, he had no problems putting Sonnenberg over, who he really liked. And this is not long after Lewis reunified the titles in 1928 with Joe Stecher. Lewis not only puts him over, Lewis puts him over in 2 straight falls. Highly recommend that you watch that match, and it'll show you it was definitely a slower pace to these matches, but it was not the 3-hour headlock on the mat that legitimate contests could sometimes be, but the work matches moved a lot quicker than that. And you'll see Sonnenberg's move that he won all his matches with was the flying tackle. So, modern wrestling. And I'll save my AEW thoughts for when I'm talking to Dan, because I have watched AEW now for about 8 weeks straight. And while I think some of the matches are very good, and while I do not think the show is as bad as I've heard it described on many of the different shows, it definitely gets old quickly, and it gets old quickly because of some of the challenges of getting over baby faces that they have, too many heels, and the only people that really seem to be able to overcome some of their storylines are the people that have a little bit of control over their storylines. But I wanted to talk with Dan about that because he's watched a couple of the shows, and I wanted to see if he thinks I'm right about what I'm seeing or not. With WWE, I tend to enjoy their premium live events since they don't call them pay-per-view anymore. Watching the weekly show is definitely a drag, and I do not have hours of my life to invest in watching a couple of matches and a whole lot of talking, when there are much better television shows on Netflix. I'd rather watch Bandidos on Netflix than watch 3 hours of Raw for 3 matches that I'm not interested in and a lot of talking. It's better now under Paul Levesque, but it is still challenging to slog through 3 hours of Raw and then the 2 hours of SmackDown. I don't even watch NXT. There's just way too much. And the last 2 months, well, at least 7 weeks, I've watched 2 hours of Dynamite on Wednesday. That's way too much to try to keep up with, number one. Number two, we don't talk about it on the podcast that much because this is a history podcast. And finally, I've discovered, and Shannon's email kind of brought this front of mind to me, I find modern wrestling best in smaller doses. So watching a premium live event, watching one show every great once in a while is enjoyable. And I think that'll be a wrap for this week. Hopefully I will be joined by somebody next week, and if I'm not, I'll be here by myself. I'll have a good history topic no matter whether I'm by myself or whether I have help. Until next time, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.